Hello, Montana, and hello, world. Chris Hislop here from the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is another episode of Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. Let me ask you, where do you get your information? Is that source reliable? Can that information actually be used against you? And how would you know if it was? That's what we're looking at this week on Connect Montana. We bring this to you with the generous support of our sponsors at Stockman Bank, Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, and Allegiance. Now let me welcome tonight's guest. Dr. Jacob Shapiro is professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University and directs the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project. He is author of The Terrorist Dilemma, Managing Violent Covert Operations, co-author of Small Wars, Big Data, The Information Revolution in Modern Conflict, and his research has been published in a broad range of academic and policy journals. Shapiro received the 2016 Karl Deutsch Award from the International Studies Association, given to a scholar younger than 40 or within 10 years of earning a PhD. He was previously president and chief scientist of Giant Oak, a venture-funded software company. He is a veteran of the United States Navy. Dr. Shapiro, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate you joining. Now, I wonder if you could start out by helping our audience understand a little bit more about the foreign efforts to influence our society, our social dynamic, particularly using social media as a tool. And then maybe some of your own work with tech giants like Microsoft to help us understand and mitigate the threats posed.
Absolutely. Happy to do that, Chris. And, yesterday, Jim did a great job of talking about what has Russia done and giving us a kind of tour of the history of their strategies. And so I thought today we could really talk about three things. Where else is this happening? How worried should you be, which is something that we didn't really get much of yesterday. And then what can be done about it? So I want to kind of talk about those three things. And I'm going to draw and work with a whole bunch of folks, and none of us do this stuff alone. But in particular, I just have to shout out my co-authors, Mason Alizada, who's moving from Princeton to Harvard this year, Josh Tucker at NYU, Cody Bunting at New Jersey Institute of Technology, Diego Martin at Purdue, and Julia Ilhart, who's also here at Princeton. So I'm going to share my screen for a minute because it's actually, if you will kindly co-host me. Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Okay. So it is actually in my contract at the university that I have to show a slide like this before every talk I give. So this is what we're going to talk about. I just said this. But the first thing to begin with is, where have these things been going on? And so since 2018, I've been working with a bunch of folks to basically build data on all the times that one country has reached out and tried to influence politics in another country through covertly manipulating their social media. And this graph here on the right basically shows you the number of those campaigns that are ongoing in any given year since 2011 and the country that initiated them. So this is, at this point, 30 different countries and 76 foreign influence efforts. And there have been 20 times when countries have reached out and tried to target their own population. And this is, this is everything from Russia trying to interfere in the 2016 election in the United States, to China supporting expat communities, talking about trying to denigrate opposition politicians to Hong Kong, to the Mexican government targeting its own population with a social media cell run out of the president's office to try and discredit negative media reports. So it's fairly widespread, but it's not yet endemic. So this map shows you all the countries that have been targeted by foreign influence efforts since 2011. And we've basically colored them a deeper blue, the ones that have been targeted more times. And so you can see it's a pretty broad swath of the world, but it's still only 30 countries. It's not everywhere. And the vast majority of these countries have been targeted by Russia, which has really adopted this as a consistent tool of its foreign policy. And in the last year, we've seen some really interesting trends in this kind of activity. And there are two that I want to highlight for people. One is countries have shifted from very expensive campaigns that are done by full-time professionals working for the government to outsourcing this to marketing companies who basically use their network to spread political content instead of selling shampoo or whatever it is they normally do. These are the 20 countries that have targeted their own populations and the year in which they first started doing so. And this is really, this technique is really something that first emerged in Russia. It has some historical roots, but the modern version of it on social media emerged in Russia in 2011 as a response to domestic political crisis. It wasn't like the Russian government set out to use this as a tool around the world. It started locally, and then over time they realized that it could be very useful. In particular, in the war in Syria and their war in the Ukraine, it proved to be very helpful, at least from their perspective, and so they started to build that technology. Okay, so what are people doing when they try and carry out these efforts? So we basically identified three main approaches that all of these campaigns apply. And some of them apply all of them, and some only apply one. But it's basically amplifying content that's already out there. So ramping up, for example, in the US on a hot button social issue like Black Lives Matter. Creating new content, trying to create new facts, things that didn't exist, but they make them up and they create some content around them. And then distorting things that are really going on and tweaking them a little bit. So they did a lot of this, for instance, around the Brexit referendum in trying to pump up and amplify the perceived benefits for the UK of leaving the EU. What these two plots highlight is that for the most part, there's not a lot of variation over time in how much these different things are used. And the domestic influence efforts use them in roughly equal proportions, while the foreign influence efforts tend to focus on creating new facts and amplifying things that people are already saying. So that's what's kind of being done about it. That's, who's doing what to whom. The next question that we want to ask is, how worried should you be? And one perspective on this is you shouldn't really be worried at all. So yeah, the stuff looks super scary. The content is really weird. It's kind of perverse and unpleasant in some sense to think about people in an office building outside St. Petersburg are reaching into our politics and pretending to be Americans. But when people look out and they try and measure how much of this are folks actually seeing, it's very little. So this is three plots from work by Jennifer Allen with David Rothschild, Marcus Mobius, and Duncan Watts, where they went out and surveyed a representative sample of Americans and got them to share all their media consumption, everything they were doing. And this is tens of thousands of people. So the standard errors on these estimates are very small. And what these plots show you is the amount of news that folks get on TV and mobile devices and desktop devices that fall into these categories of not news in blue, news in green, and then fake news in red. And if you squint like really hard and look closely at these plots, and they're on your computer so you can zoom in if you want to, there's a tiny little red line at the top of each of these. The average minutes per day that the average American sees of fake news is tiny. It's vanishingly small. And so that might lead you to be like not worried about this and think maybe this isn't such a problem after all. Yes, there are some scary examples, but much like terrorism, it's a problem that the press and the media have blown way out of proportion and to the actual harm that's induced. And it also turns out that the vast majority of this is seen by a very small number of users. So this is from work by my colleague Andy Guess at Princeton. And what Andy did is he went out and he got a representative sample of Americans to let him install tracking software on their computers before the 2016 election, so he could see everything they were doing online and everything they were looking at in terms of politics. And so that plot on the left shows you how many, what share of visits to fake news sites came from people who were consumed a left-wing media diet down at 1 and a right-wing media diet up at 10. And then of the things that they looked at, of the fake news websites that they hit, how much was pro-Clinton and how much was pro-Trump. What you can see is that most of the consumption was by folks on the right, not all, but most of it. And of the fake news tended to skew in 2016 pro-Trump versus pro-Clinton. of all the fake news that was consumed by Americans in the 2016 election, based on Andy's work, more than 80% was seen by only 10% of the users. So it's a small number of people that are seeing it. So small number of people, vanishingly small part of the media diet. So that should all make you think, like, why the hell are we spending our time together tonight? Like, this really isn't a big deal. But there's some reason to be worried. So this is from wonderful work by Juan Morales, who's a scholar at University Carlos Alberto in Italy. And what Juan has done is he collected data on this moment in time in 2013 when Twitter shut down a large network of bots that were retweeting everything that Nicolas Maduro says. So this is one of those domestic efforts where Maduro had set up a boiler room where he had a bunch of people managing Twitter accounts, and they were just retweeting everything he was saying, and they were running automated accounts that were doing it. And so on this date in fall 2013, Twitter identified this as a bot network and shut it down. So all of a sudden, they turn off the spigot on this massive domestic influence effort. And what happened, which is quite striking, is that on that day, what this plot shows you is each of those dots is the average number of likes that tweets get for tweets by opposition figures in blue, government figures in red, and sports commentators in green. And you'll notice on the day that Twitter takes down all these fake bots that were jamming up the social media conversation in Venezuela with things Maduro was saying, all of a sudden on that day, people suddenly start paying more attention to the opposition tweets. So it's not that these things were saying anything different. All they were doing was jamming up the conversation space. And so individuals who might otherwise have liked the activity by the opposition weren't doing it. Twitter shuts that down, and all of a sudden the conversation changes. So despite the fact that not that many people were seeing those tweets and no one was paying attention to them, and there might not be that much fake news actually viewed, the online influence effort here had a major impact on the conversation. The number of, the amount of attention that opposition political figures were getting in Venezuela jumps immediately on that day. So that's like some reason to be worried. Okay, so that's exposure, things to be worried about, so what can be done about it? So one of the things that we might think about doing about this is we might think about having like the equivalent of the National Weather Service for social media. Might be nice if, say, DHS or CISA or some part of the federal government went out and every day told the American people, look, here is how much content that this country or that country is trying to inject in our conversations. Here are the topics that they're talking about, and here's how much it's changed since last week. Now, for that to work, what we need is we need a system that can say, given what we know they're doing today, can we figure out tomorrow what content is theirs and what content is normal Americans, and separate the two? And there are all kinds of organizations out there figuring out what they're doing today. The intelligence community is doing it, NGOs are doing it, fact-checking organizations are doing it, the platforms are doing it. Lots of people are finding content that are part of these campaigns 2, 3, 4 weeks after the content first hits the internet. But what no one's doing is looking at the things that are coming in new and saying, can we separate those things into part of their activity and not part of their activity? And so what Maysam, Josh Cody, and I built, and we recently published a piece on this in Science Advances, is we built a system that's kind of, the schematic is here, that basically took those labels, extracted from them this thing, this post-URL pair, which is like some text and a link out to some other content. I'll show you that in a minute. And we built a system that would look at those and figure out, is this part of what the trolls are doing, or is it normal user behavior? And this is something that, like, this is the kind of thing that social media companies are doing all the time, except usually what's there on the left is, did you buy something or not after viewing it? What's on the top, instead of external data sources, is the data feed they've bought from the company that is trying to sell you stuff. Then they put it into an algorithm that figures out how do they get you to buy things more efficiently, and then separate you into different categories of buyers. So the top one, instead of troll activity, might be, this is activity by someone who we think we can sell Patagonia to. And on the bottom is, we think we can sell you Carhartt. And then they serve you up ads based on that. So this is like, this kind of stuff is going on in the background in social media all the time. what we wanted to do is apply it to content like this. So this is an example of a tweet by a Russian troll that says, look, this person was shot to death in a luxury SUV in the Bronx, and links out to this shortened URL. So you can expand that URL out. And then that piece of content breaks down into a whole bunch of what we call features. So the number of words, is it a retweet? Is there a shortened word in it? There's some machine learning voodoo down at the bottom to get like the emotional score and whatnot. And then on the right column, there's a bunch of things that are context about this. So is the hashtag in this tweet one that is often being used by trolls? Is it referencing a local news website or a national news website? Does it mention a politician, and so on? And so for every piece of content, you build this big list of features for that content. And then you can throw them into that algorithm, and you can do a whole bunch of different tests. And what we did is we did the thing that stock trading companies do, that hedge funds do when they want to test out a trading algorithm. They basically run it historically. And so what we did is we said, we know now who the Russian trolls were in 2015, 16, 17, and 18. So let's simulate the situation where in each month over that period, we got to see what the trolls were doing. And we could compare them to a sample of normal people. And we could train that algorithm. And then we could see how well would it do in these different tasks. So find things that it hasn't been shown in this month. Find things in the next month that are part of the campaign. Find things in the next month that are part of the campaign that are accounts they've never ever used before. And if the algorithm can do pretty well at these 5 tasks, then we could have that National Weather Service for social media. The government could take, or other actors, some civically minded organization, could take all the things the fact checkers are finding and all the things the platforms are finding and scan social media on a regular basis and see what is part of a troll campaign and what is not. Okay, so these are the data we worked with. I put this up because I have to tell people what the data are whenever I do a talk, but it's a lot of pieces of content, about 50 million pieces of content on Twitter and about 6 million pieces of content on Reddit. 3 different countries, 4 different campaigns, every month that we could do, 5 tasks, about 453 experiments in all. Okay, so really quickly, I want to show you a couple of facts about the Russian campaign because it's kind of interesting. So if we thought that these folks were like super sophisticated and whatnot, that would be wrong. In the sense that these are the Russian troll accounts that were active through 2019 and when the accounts were created. So what you can see here, which I think is interesting, is there are basically these 3 or 4 or maybe 5, depending on how you stare at the graph, moments in time when the manager walked into the IRA and he said, guys, this week we're going to do a sprint and everyone is going to create accounts. And they built a whole bunch of accounts. And then over the next 4 years, they spent them down gradually. So this is the number of new accounts that are tweeting as part of the Russian troll campaign over time. So you build them up and you spend them over time. Now, the reason that's important for thinking about that National Weather Service process is the only reason you would do this in this way is because, number one, it's a pain in the butt to create an account. And number 2, I mean, not really, it's pretty easy, but it's a marginal cost. It takes a little time. But then to get a bunch of people following it, you have to build it up slowly. If you build it up too quickly, then Twitter will identify that and shut you down. So there's not like this inelastic supply of accounts. There's actually a lot of friction in the system that they have to deal with. Okay. So this is showing you how this system performed against China and Venezuela. And I don't want to say much about this. The F1 score is like a standard measure of machine learning performance. This is performance over time from 2016 through 2018 against China on Twitter and Venezuela on Twitter for finding accounts next month that are part of the campaign this month that have never been used before. So this is like the manager comes in and says, hey, we need 10 new accounts working on the US social media influence campaign, put them into production. And we're asking how many of those can we find? And depending on the month, it's between 70 and 80% for China. It's usually very, very good for Venezuela. You can also pull things across platforms. So this is from some slides that Cody used for presentation a couple of days ago. This is an example on top of some Russian activity on Twitter. So we trained the model on Russian activity on Twitter, and then it went out and it found almost exactly the same thing on Reddit. So you can move across platform in this way. Okay, so the last thing I want to kind of show you here is that, and this is really like how this works in a dramatic way, is what features are important is very dynamic. So when you do this machine learning process, one of the things you get out of it is in every month you get a measure of which features are important. So early on, they were tweeting during the work hours in Russia. And so in early 2015, what work hour in the US they were on was really important. That's that middle graph. That left graph, though, if something is uses one of the top hashtags that trolls use, I want to dig in on that and show you that a little more specifically. So this is a picture of the Internet Research Agency, the office building in Russia where a lot of the campaign against the US was organized. Here are a couple tweets on both sides of an issue by them in summer 2017. Pro-Trump on the top, anti-Trump on the bottom. And notice here that they are pointing to particular URLs. This is an example of the Venezuelan activity. Here, what they're doing is they're pointing to these websites that almost no one goes on. Okay, Trump Train News, Aria Wilson. These are very weird things. Normal users don't mention them. And so in September 2016, if you look at the top hashtags from the trolls on the left and the normal Americans on the right, you'll notice that there are a couple of these issues: MAGA, Make America, MAGA, Trump, TCOT. These are things that normal users weren't tweeting about. The trolls were really in the lead on those in September 2016. And normal users were very concerned with the debates, right? We were coming up to election. They talked a lot about that. Fast forward 2 months, and now these two graphs look very similar. The hashtags that are being used by both groups is similar. So the lesson behind this, which is, I think, really important for thinking about what can be done here, is the activity is very dynamic. Right? There's not like one signal that marks a troll over time. What's different between the trolls and the normal users is continually changing. And the reason it's continually changing, and the reason you need like a national weather service, not like here is the one kind of content you should ignore, is that normal behavior online is an incredibly dynamic thing. There's new issues all the time. There are new services that come in. TikTok shows up and all of a sudden one demographic stops doing something on Twitter and starts doing it on TikTok. And so normal is moving around. The trolls are moving around because new political issues are showing up. They're trying new tactics. But in every period that we looked at, there was always some signal which separated them from normal. And if you stop for a minute and step back, and this is where I'll end, and think about what's going on here. Like, what does it take to produce one of these campaigns that goes out to another country? You need to get a bunch of people who aren't good enough to get jobs at a legit marketing firm into a room, have them produce content on a country they don't know, in a language they learned in school, and follow political issues there in a sufficiently subtle way that they can move the politics in that country without being so obvious that people are like, hey, I think this dude's a Russian troll, I'm gonna report him. That is a wicked hard task. And now you think about running an organization with the high turnover that any online marketing company has, where people are working long hours and getting burned out and changing all the time. And so you're gonna need some manuals, some standard templates, some ways for people to do things. And all of that is gonna make the content artificially consistent. And that means we're gonna be able to find it.
Wow, Dr. Shapiro, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, I'm just going to use the facilitator's prerogative to say we're going to run past time. I hope that's okay with you, because I'm sure we have a number of questions from our participants. They may have come to you, Dr. Shapiro, when you had host. I don't know if any incoming questions to you, but I have some here I'd like to kick off with,
Absolutely.
if I could. So, I mean, what I found fascinating is your development of the use of tech to help us understand how tech is being used against us and to try to mitigate that. I mean, that's a fascinating effort. And it was explained so well. I'm wondering if there is also a balance. When you talked about the national weather system, I immediately thought, well, what about an international weather system or international norms? So in addition to, developing tech that can help us in this effort, are there kind of non-tech efforts afoot that complement that work?
So I think there's a great set of efforts going on around fact checking and around building fact checking organizations all around the world. So Pointer, which is an NGO, has created something called the International Fact Checking Network that is doing a wonderful job of establishing standards for fact checking and supporting journalists around the world who are trying to call out fake news. Avaz is a fantastic organization that covers parts of the world Pointer does not, and supports independent fact checkers and then aggregates that information in ways that are really useful. So that kind of thing is happening. And the companies are taking actions to build capacity to find this stuff. What is not happening is a concerted effort led by a major power, say the EU or the US, to go out and craft a set of international norms that says, you know what we're not going to do to each other? We're not going to reach out and muck about in each other's politics in this skullduggerous manner. If you want to put up propaganda and like set up websites and do like Voice of America and RT stuff, like that's fine, that's your prerogative. But you don't get, as a nation state that has good standing in the world community, to go out and create fake human beings that appear to be in another country. Because look, what's happened with technology, Chris, is not that countries can do something they never did before. Right? The US sent dozens of people to countries that were at risk of kind of moving towards the communists during the Cold War to shape their politics. Russia sent dozens or hundreds of people here into Western Europe to support the nuclear freeze movement and try and mess up politics. But to do that, you needed to find these unicorns, these rare human beings who could learn to behave like someone from the other country, not come to their intelligence services attention, and push politics effectively in that country. And there are like 6 of those people in all of the United States or USSR at any one point in time. Now what you can do is you can set up an office building outside of your, largest city or your commercial center, staff it with a bunch of schlemiels with degrees in marketing, and have them achieve similar effects. And so what that means is this is no longer a capability that only the most powerful countries can use sparingly. It's something that's widely available. And that's risky in a way that traditional stuff just wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, that was my next question, Dr. Shapiro, which is, you mentioned that in its early stages, it was a very expensive undertaking. And of course, it's gotten cheaper. And your own research and other writing on this topic says, hey, this is super cheap. The tech costs next to nothing, and doing it is really cheap. So the question is maybe the forward-looking question, which is, today we see Russia, China, Saudi, Iran doing this stuff. But as this gets cheaper and ostensibly easier, what do we see in the future where we do not have international norms, we do not have an international weather service? Is this going to become ubiquitous? Can anybody use this, and what would be the impact of that?
So I worry that it will become more ubiquitous, Chris. That it has not so far suggests to me that one of 2 things is going on. Either the majority of states view this as out of bounds and problematic for their reputation, so they don't want to engage in it, or it's actually not so easy to do well. So one of the things that we observe is that it's fairly hard to find the Russian content, especially in 2018. It's much easier to find the Chinese content, and it's really easy to find the Venezuelan content. And if you look at what they do in terms of the topics that they talk about, the Russians are very good at making their trolls discuss a range of topics that looks like normal Americans. Mm-hmm. The Chinese and Venezuelans, the topics they talk about are really weird. Most normal people on Twitter either talk about a lot of stuff or like 2 issues. And there's like almost no one in between. The Chinese and Venezuelans had lots of accounts that talk about like 10 to 15 issues over their lifespan. And that's just not a thing that normal people do. And so I actually think part of the limiting factor here may not be that it's hard to produce, but that it's hard to do well enough that it's not totally obvious to everyone in the conversation. And so people just ignore you.
And on that one, I noticed that the F-score of your tech, over time is improving dramatically, in fact. And so that would simply suggest, in any other kind of conflict or any kind of quote unquote arms race, that, the enemy is going to develop and produce something smarter than your weapon, and then you will do the same and they will do the same. What looms in the future, Jake, when you look at your tech coming out? Is it can it be defeated, and if so, how?
So I think that the thing people worry a lot about is the synthetic creation of content. So you can get those humans out of the loop and start to use AI to produce content. And then you have AI trying to find it and AI trying to produce it. And you end up like clogging the ecosystem. And I worry a little bit about that, but not much, because there's a really simple solution to that, which is make account creation costly and expensive and hard. And then for you or me to create an account that we're going to use for 20 years, totally worth it. For an influence campaign to use an account they're going to burn in 2 weeks, not worth it. So like if we start to get to that world, what you'll have is getting on platforms will be expensive, and you'll have to go through a whole bunch of vetting, and then you'll be on and it'll be a perfectly fine environment.
That's it. There's a lot of beauty in that simplicity, of course. Dr. Shapiro, I mean, incredibly fascinating. I'm going to have to wrap up now, but I'd like to give you the last word if there's anything else that you'd like to mention.
No, just to say thanks to everyone for this, and make sure you are registered and voting in the coming election.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shapiro. Really appreciate you joining the show, and thank you to the participants and to our sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, and Stockman Bank. Now, Dr. Shapiro mentioned that yesterday we had Dr. Jim Ludis from the Pell Center come on and talk about the historical aspects of disinformation, misinformation, and fake news and how it is appearing today. That, as well as this show and all of our Connect Montana shows, you can find on our YouTube channel. Simply go to YouTube and write the Montana World Affairs Council. You'll find it all there. Tomorrow at noon, not at 7 p.m., but at noon, we have Lynn Walsh. She's an Emmy Award-winning journalist who's also looking at the same issue, but from a media and journalism perspective. So please join us. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your colleagues that we're going to be on tomorrow at noon with Lynn Walsh. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. Hope you are all well. Have a good night. See you tomorrow.